Welcome to meeting number 20 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, the end motion adopted by the committee on October 24, 2020, the committee is resuming its study on processing capacity. And today is the last meeting actually on the witnesses. So today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. And therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using Zoom application. Proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. I would like to take this opportunity to remind all participants that this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of the screen is not permitted. Alors, pour garantir le bon déroulement de la réunion, j'aimerais vous faire part de
To ensure that this runs smoothly, I'd like to share a few rules with you. The members and witnesses may use the language of their choice to speak. Interpretation services are available during the entire meeting. On your screen, you can choose the floor, English or French. With the latest version of Zoom, you can now choose your language without having to choose the corresponding language channel. You'll also notice that the raise hand function of the platform is now more readily available on the main bar. If you would like to speak, please let the chairman know. If this option does not work, I suggest that the members and witnesses who would like to speak activate their camera and raise their hand. The clerk of the committee will take into account if you would like to take the floor. If you are not speaking, please mute your microphone.
Witnesses today, and we have from Fraser Valley Specialty Poultry, Mr. Ken Falk, President. Welcome, Mr. Falk. And also from Canard du Lac Brome Limité, Philippe O'Shaughnessy. Welcome, Mr. O'Shaughnessy. And we'll start with opening statement, 7.5 minutes maximum. And we'll start with the Fraser Valley Specialty Poultry, Mr. Falk. You have up to 7.5 minutes to do your opening statement. Thank you, Mr. Falk.
Yes, just to check, everybody, you can hear me?
Yes, all good.
Okay. Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Ken Falk. I'm a third-generation farmer in Canada. 2 more generations are already active on our family farm. Fraser Valley Specialty Poultry produces ducks, geese, and specialty chickens in Chilliwack, British Columbia. And I'm the Vice President of the Canadian Commercial Waterfowl Producers Association. We are encouraged that stability, renewal capacity, competitiveness, and food security are important to government. The Barton Report says that bold ideas will improve Canada's economic growth, and being a global food champion tomorrow cannot be held back by how we worked yesterday. Winning requires bolder ambitions, an urgent strategy, and a new form of cooperation between the private and public sector. Meanwhile, other countries are increasing outputs, often supported by subsidies with much lower standards, to the detriment of Canadian farmers struggling to compete against these imports or in export markets. So I want to highlight a couple of personal experiences that expose barriers to achieving our objectives. Barrier number 1, the food sector faces overregulation with inconsistent, unreasonable, heavy, and even sometimes underhanded enforcement tactics by the CFIA. In our case, we were wrongfully charged for interprovincial movement of product, and details of this are in my brief that I submitted earlier. Charges must be based on evidence, not mere conjecture, speculation, and mistakes. The harm, apparently, that could be done, they said, was monetary losses due to unfair competition. Facing $52,000 in fines, we spent over $214,000 in legal fees and 5 years to clear our name. This has seriously impacted our family, with many sleepless nights and incredible stress. It's been unfair, unethical, unprofessional, and disrespectful. My character and integrity was called into question time and again. They say this is just a cost of doing business for us. Trust has been destroyed, and they say now I just need to move forward with a positive attitude. I ask today that you restore our faith in government and make this right. I'm confident that not one of you, as our elected parliamentarians, intended that we be treated this way. The Administrative Monetary Penalties Act and regulations must be changed. Eliminate the kangaroo court that CFIA operates. Ensure there is practical recourse, and key defenses such as due diligence must be available. CFIA staff must be held to account when they get it wrong, not if, but when, or they will carelessly file wrongful charges again. Their cultural norm is to take punitive action instead of using a cooperative approach. We could have solved the situation in minutes. Instead, we spent years fighting. Civilian oversight would bring accountability. The ministers have refused to engage, and the complaints and appeals process is a sham. We can learn a lot from the things we teach our children. That is to be fair, empathetic, helpful, trustworthy, respectful, and kind. When we make mistakes, we acknowledge it quickly. We apologize and we make it right. Sadly, this has not been my experience with government. This punitive gotcha style of inspection must stop. This new cooperation between private and public sectors is possible, but will require these bold ambitions, as the culture is so deeply entrenched today. Barrier number 2. Over the past 5 years, large quantities of very poor quality ducks have been imported into Canada. CFIA said it was produced in an equivalent system and wasn't required to meet Canadian standards. We strongly disagree. Independent testing revealed how bad the product really was, as not one sample tested met Canadian standards. And CFIA's first response was to try to discredit the report. Labeling was also deficient. To instruct a consumer to warm raw poultry thoroughly before consumption could result in a serious food safety problem. CFIA said that Canadians will know how to handle raw poultry. Yet we know if one of us had done that, product would be recalled and the producer would face huge fines. Selling prices were well below the cost of production, likely due to subsidies in other countries, but also to lower standards of inspection, workers' rights, wages, animal welfare, and the environment. A duck is a duck. They're sourced from similar genetic suppliers, consuming similar feeds, and are raised much the same. There's no secret formula. The only difference is input costs. We are held to high standards in Canada, and that's good. We only ask that they be reasonable, that they provide a level playing field, and that we are treated fairly. And this has not happened. We don't understand why government would knowingly want to run us out of business. After recent meetings with the CFIA, we are hopeful that this is being resolved, but serious harm has already been done. The waterfowl sector in Canada is struggling, and we fear these inequities will happen again and again. And here's the irony. We've suffered serious monetary losses due to unfair competition, but CFIA says they don't consider that. But that's exactly why they wrongfully charged me in the first place. So if you want stability, renewal, capacity, and competitiveness, stop the unfair treatment. Be fair. Support Canada's producers. A third barrier is access to capital. As a niche market in the poultry sector, we're often overlooked. I'm also a supply managed producer, and so I work with my friends in supply management, only to find that those sectors will be eligible, but we're not. We just don't have the lobby power, so effectively we're forgotten. We struggle with lenders, particularly in recent years, with the unfair competition and the treatment by CFIA, driving margins down to the point that we are barely able to survive. Banks don't lend to struggling companies in the real world. The impacts of COVID-19 have been devastating for our sector. Duck is primarily a food service product, and as you know, that sector has been decimated. We didn't enter COVID with the cash to survive lengthy shutdowns, so we've all had to cut production and lay off staff. Now we fear that cheap foreign duck will flood into Canada again. Please don't let that happen. We can supply Canadians with duck while producing a world-class product for export. The same standards and laws that we uphold in Canada must be enforced on all who want to import to Canada, and there must be substantial changes if we are to compete well in export markets. We need to be supported in our efforts by government in order to be profitable. So if you want stability, renewal, capacity, and competitiveness, you want to protect food security, I say rebuild trust. If we can trust one another, the unfairness would not happen, and the adversarial gotcha style of inspection would finally come to an end, and the punitive enforcement would be replaced with cooperation. I ask you to take the lead. It's going to take that urgent strategy, but it will be worth it. Again, I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Mr. Falk. And now, Canard du Lac Brome Limité, Monsieur Philippe O'Shaughnessy, for up to 7.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Oui, bonjour.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee. My name is Philip O'Shaughnessy, General Manager of the company Ducks of Brome Lake. Our company began operations almost 110 years ago. We have several farms and 2 processing plants. Our main site is located in Val des Sources in the Eastern Townships. Can everybody hear me? Very well. I would like to take the time today to share with you 2 of the company's biggest challenges in the short and medium term: labor shortages and high production costs. Currently, the company's bottleneck is the lack of unskilled labor in our processing plants, mainly at the Val des Sources slaughter site. We currently operate our processing centers with a number of employees that is below the minimum required threshold, which has a direct impact on our production volume. This great lack of manpower also means that many byproducts cannot be recovered for sale and are therefore wasted, representing a loss of several $100,000 annually. This problem seems to be widespread in slaughter sites in Quebec and seems to be much more important for companies located in regions like ours. The latter do not in fact have access to the labor pool of nearby large cities. We believe that the Canadian government can easily resolve this issue by allowing more temporary foreign workers into our food processing sites. Indeed, with more of these workers, we could quickly increase our processing volumes. This approach seems to be the best solution in our minds. This approach, in fact, has proven its worth in our company so far, both in agriculture and in processing. These workers are recognized as being of high quality and reliability. In addition, they occupy unskilled labor positions that too few Canadians want to occupy. The current limit of 10% is clearly insufficient to meet our needs. With respect to our specific situation, a limit of 30% of temporary foreign workers would be required to meet our unskilled labor needs. The second issue that we would like to bring to your attention is the high processing costs that are constantly increasing and are definitely a barrier to increasing our processing capacity. We're essentially talking here about environmental management costs and animal health and welfare requirements imposed by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. We're also talking about salary increases, as well as the general increase in all other production costs. In our industry, these cost increases are very rarely offset by price increases. In our duck industry, profit margins are constantly decreasing. This situation is a barrier to the development of new markets. Moreover, in our case, we are in a niche market. Brome Lake Ducks must therefore make additional and essential efforts to promote its products and create new consumption habits. This is what has been successfully done by Brome Lake Duck since the beginning of 2000 on the retail market in Quebec. In fact, we have to face the fact that the North American population consumes little duck, contrary to the European and Asian populations. The investments had been important, and the return on investment had been conclusive. However, to pursue this approach outside of Quebec, we would have to invest far too much money in consumer education through tastings and advertising campaigns. This is now too risky a gamble financially because the return on investment is far from guaranteed. For instance, products imported at a discount from certain European countries have benefited substantially from our offensives without having to invest any money in market development. We recommend that the government offer support in target markets and financial assistance for the development of new markets. In the same vein, we're seeing a growing number of buyers turning to imported products. We therefore see that more buyers are turning to imported products at lower prices and with lower quality standards than Canadian standards. Canadian standards of CFIA are recognized by industry as the highest in the world. However, European and American standards are now considered equivalent to those in Canada. The high cost of CFIA standards compared to those of the European Union means that our cost of production is sometimes higher than the selling price in some of these countries. Therefore, Since the free trade agreement, some Canadian products find themselves at a distinct disadvantage compared to foreign products. Many customers are not ready to pay the costs related to these standards. These standards are no longer necessarily to our advantage. The fact that we have stopped selling in Japan in favor of other markets is a perfect example. The role of the federal government, therefore, is crucial in this matter. It is by reviewing the equivalency standards that it will allow Canadian products to be competitive with imported products. In conclusion, we recommend that action be put in place for the following: to address the problem of unskilled labor shortages, including temporary foreign workers. Secondly, provide financial support to enable the development of new markets. And thirdly, ensure that all products imported into Canada meet the same standards as those required for Canadian products. I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity it provided our company to share its challenges to increase our transformation capacity and competitiveness. Thank you.
Alors, merci, Monsieur O'Shaughnessy.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Shaughnessy. We will now move on to the question period. And we'll begin with 6 minutes. Mr. Lehoux, please go ahead. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of our witnesses for being with us this afternoon. My first question. We see that the issues are similar for both of our witnesses. This is the issue of labor. That is also an important issue. You've also spoken a great deal about regulation of CFIA. Mr. Falk, you have indicated to us that this is harmful regulation. I understand that you have experienced specific issues with the agency. Beyond that, when you speak about product labeling for imported products from other countries, the aspect of labeling, in my mind, also speaks to the reciprocity of norms, standards for products coming into the country. Do you believe that there should be greater emphasis placed on this reciprocity of standards? Mr. Falk? And I certainly don't want to mispronounce your name, Mr. Shaughnessy, but the gentleman from the Lake Brome Duck. Either one of you can answer, or perhaps who would like to go first?
I can start with that. Yes, clearly there needs to be reciprocity, both in terms of standards of processing, but also in terms of labeling. And we saw a number of deficiencies on the labeling coming into the country. And in fact, we saw a lot of product being sold that was labeled for institutional or food service use, and it was being sold into retail. And so it was not labeled appropriately for the retail market. And there really was no recourse for us, because once the product is on the retail shelf, it would require a recall, and CFIA was not prepared to do that. Philip, if you have something to add.
Non, je pense que je suis en ligne avec Monsieur.
No, I concur with Mr. Falk. The issue is often complying with regulation and to imply the same standards, both here and regarding imported products. And you mentioned that currently the reciprocity standards were accepted in terms of what is coming from Europe and the United States. But in actual terms, you're not sure whether or not we have the same standards. That's correct. And we do our own studies. We have also commissioned third-party independent experts to do studies, and we've realized that there are products that, had we produced them, these would never have left our plants. Regarding labor, you've mentioned this 10%, and that's certainly not the first time that we've heard that it is insufficient, but you've also spoken to access to temporary foreign workers. But to move from 10 to 30, would you say that this has been a more pressing needs in the last few years, or is this recent? Well, I know that a lot of pressure is being put on industry to increase it to 20%, and that seems to be widespread. And this rule seems to apply to a majority of companies. As I've mentioned, the fact that we're in the region means that it exacerbates the issue. I was speaking about this with others in the industries, that in our case, for instance, those who are lucky to not be so far from Montreal are able to easily obtain workers who commute back and forth. In our case, well, we're far too far away for that to occur. But 30% would certainly help. But it's been a number of years that it's been a problem. So it does go back a number of years. Thank you. So I think that we would settle part of the problem, but that's mostly for processing plants or for production, or are both seeing a major shortage of labor. Our problems are mainly in the processing plants. In production, I take it that you mean by animal production. This issue was settled a number of years back because, as you no doubt know, there isn't really a limit when it comes to agricultural labor there. So clearly this problem is solved, but we do have a lot of foreign workers. But these are two different programs. It isn't the same one as for industrial workers. So at the end of the day, this has given rise to the situation you're seeing, and that's more of a processing issue. And earlier you mentioned processing costs. So perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on that? In terms of processing costs, well, they've increased across the board. Earlier, I mentioned the environmental requirements, also the animal welfare requirements that have become more and more important over the last 2 years. This involves more oversight from the farm to the processing plant. There are much more stringent environmental requirements, so we have to take measures to make improvements. And of course, there are other costs as well. Labor costs have increased substantially in our sector, that is in duck. The fact is that the prices haven't kept pace. So you mentioned the question of animal welfare. When we mention reciprocity, do we have similar working methods, whether this be in the United States or elsewhere in Europe? Well, a lot of our people have seen all of the plants. They have visited many plants throughout the world, and we certainly can confirm that there are practices put in place elsewhere which are absolutely not acceptable here in Canada. Yes, so thank you very much, Mr. Liu. We'll move on to Mrs. Bissett for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much to our witnesses as well for being here. And my questions are for the Lac Brome, and I do think I recognize the white building in Knowlton on that road, unless I'm mistaken. I think those are yours. I lived on Knowlton Road for several years and on Oak Road, which isn't very far away. So obviously, your company is one of the best companies in the region. And you've mentioned the labor shortage. We know that this labor shortage occurs mostly in specialized sectors. So how can the federal government can help you to attract and train labor in processing plants where perhaps the jobs are less desirable? Well, I don't know if I expressed myself correctly. I used the word non-skilled labor when I mentioned jobs. These are jobs on the processing lines, the slaughterhouse lines. These are employees that don't necessarily have a skilled trade. These are people that we train ourselves. So on that level, we're not facing the same issues who are higher skilled. We certainly wouldn't say that it isn't easy to train them. It takes a long time. In the past, I think recruitment was much easier than it is today. However, it has become very complicated, but that's something that everybody else is seeing. We are able to do this more highly specialized employees. We're successful there, but where there are problems, it's when it comes to production employees, and we do the training ourselves. In your opening statement, you also mentioned that the labor shortage leads to a waste in products. Could you perhaps elaborate on that problem? In normal times, that is when you have a slaughterhouse that is fully staffed, 100% of the duck is used. The feather, everything that is not edible. But in the case of a duck, we use the tongue, the feet, everything is used. But when we're short on labor, unfortunately, we have to throw away certain parts that we could use and that we would use in the past. So just a personal question, what do you do with the feathers? Well, we send them to the export market for insulation, for coats, for pillows. Duck feathers are the best feathers to be used for these products, and specifically Canadian duck feathers are recognized as being among the best, even better than the Americans. Well, that's a positive side for ducks here. Well, the committee has heard extensively about technology innovation, and we know that automation could replace some jobs, but not all. So to what extent can automation be a solution to carry out the kind of work that your company does? Well, as you no doubt know, we're fortunate, perhaps unfortunate, to having to build a completely new processing plant in 2016 with all new technology. So we're fortunate to have the most modern plant in Canada. We have the very best worldwide. It's mainly from Europe, but that's how we're set up now. So certainly, when we compare this to our former facilities from 2015 and before, we have some very interesting devices in place that enables us to save on labor. But at a certain point, this is extremely specialized. There are a number of operations that come into play, and that's usually true for processing. There will always remain a certain portion of manual labor involved. And if we were completely automate, that would be extremely expensive. It's a small market. You also spoke about duck imports from Europe, whose standards are under or below our food safety standards. So do you think that we have the right measures in place to protect Canadian workers here? Well, theoretically, when everything is properly implemented, the way that the legislation is put together, it is well done, it works. And it does protect Canadians, both when it comes to products made here or made elsewhere, but where there seem to be issues is when you look at how many resources you require to manage this. On site, we have many resources from the agency on site to look at the least detail, whereas when it comes to import products, we don't have the same measures put in place. And this isn't entirely reciprocal. It's not reciprocal because we cannot import on the European market, but it's far more bureaucratic. It's much more difficult for us to obtain approvals than it is for foreign products coming here. I have 30 seconds left. So aside from what you've already discussed, what kind of investment would you like to see to help the processing sector, specifically in the regions? In the regions, as I've mentioned, our major issues involve manpower, the labor force, and developing the market. As to the labor force, the idea is to try and attract the right kind of workers that we require in our facilities. And if we want to sell more on other markets, we need to focus on niche markets like ours. And we're trying to develop markets from nothing, and that's quite tough. Thank you very much, Mr. Shaughnessy. Thank you, Mrs. Bissette. Now, Mr. Talon, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Shaughnessy. To our witnesses, as Milou mentioned, it seems to me that the issues you have raised are similar. So what could be changed? Mr. Shaughnessy, I'll turn it over to you first. So what could be changed to rebalance the situation? Because we've heard this several times. That is, everything that comes from the outside simply doesn't meet with our standards. What can we do tangibly as we try and develop recommendations for government? Well, we've been experiencing that problem for a number of years now. In the past, it was difficult for us to be heard. And I'd say that that was likely our biggest issue. But I have to admit that over the past few months, there has been a great deal of development. We were put into contact with the president of CFIA, and we noted that truly we were heard and that measures were taken. So I think the mechanics of being heard and of putting in place concrete action Well, the Canadian Duck Producers Association has had to pay independent studies. We had to conduct our own studies. But to be heard has been a problem in order for us to argue our point. So currently, you're getting to part of Mr. Falk's statement where he mentioned this relationship of trust. He mentioned that it's more of a relationship of mistrust and tension rather than collaboration. But are you saying that this is changing? Did I understand that correctly? Well, as far as I'm concerned, yes. We've seen a lot of progress being achieved. And I think there has been a change in the communication that we've had with government over the last 5 months or so. And that is the right thing to do. So are you seeing a change in how foreign products are dealt with? Yes, we're seeing a change. Currently, there's a given context right now. There are people from Europe who have stopped their production as well. But from what was previously unacceptable, we haven't seen much of that this time around. So, Mr. Falk, you don't seem to have had the same positive experience. Could you perhaps speak a little bit more to your unpleasant experience, if I understood you correctly?
By all means. So I've been at this battle with the CFIA for over 6 years. Mr. O'Shaughnessy has entered the scene more recently, and so Mr. O'Shaughnessy's predecessor, Claude Trottier, was involved in the battle alongside of myself and members from King Cole Ducks in Ontario. And so we saw a marked change several months ago when the president did become involved, and we've appreciated that change. But it took years of battle to get to that point, and it should never take that long. It should never be that much of an issue. There was denial and deflection and all of the things that, basically saying, well, it was all produced in an equivalent system, and so therefore it's fine. Well, we knew that it wasn't fine, but yet there was just an attempt to discredit any information we would bring to them. So yeah, my experience is quite different, because it's been such a long, protracted battle.
Je comprends que vous.
So if I were to put the same question to you, that is, what would your recommendations be to avoid a similar situation from reoccurring or to avoid it occurring in another sector, if that were to happen?
And I referred to it in my presentation, and that is that without civilian oversight, I don't see that there's going to be change in the agency. There has to be consequences when things have gone so wrong, and they have gone wrong for years. There is a very much an acrimonious relationship that has built over many, many years, and the adoption of the Safe Food for Canadians Act does resolve some of it, but it doesn't resolve the cultural piece, and that's the piece, in my view, that has to change. That culture has to change within government.
OK. Culture organisationnelle, peut-être un.
So you're saying that perhaps accountability would be required. Now, you've said that you're seeing a labor shortage. I think both of you are seeing labor shortage issues. Mr. O'Shaughnessy, but you're the first that has mentioned the number of 30, and it's odd that you're saying that because in the past that's what was asked, but it was reduced to 10. But many of our witnesses asked for 10, so we're wondering if that would be enough, if we should perhaps not go up to 30. I understand your answer, though, that there is a regional dynamic at play here. Yes, certainly there is a regional dynamic. And I know that a number of slaughterhouses were at 20%. And if they were 20%, that would solve their issues. In my case, I'm going to be extremely challenged when it comes to this number. Regarding the immigration policy, you also mentioned this in your brief. That could be one solution, or it could be part of the solution, not only to bring foreign workers in, but you have proposals that you could submit to the committee as to how this could assist you. Well, very quickly, please. 10 seconds. Well, what's clear, And I do know that this is very difficult to implement, but that would be to bring people to live in the Val de Source region. Thank you very much to Mr. Shaughnessy, Mr. McAllister, Mr. McGregor, rather.
6 minutes.
Okay,
Sorry
thank you,
about that.
Mr. Chair.
Not that I don't.
Thank you to our witnesses for contributing to this study, and maybe Mr. Falk, I'll start with you. It's in line with what Ms. Bissett was asking Mr. O'Shaughnessy. So, like on the foreign imports, like most of our competition is coming from Europe, like in terms of duck, right? Is that pretty much it?
Yes, from Europe and from the U.S. The challenge with it coming from Europe is that it's coming in so terribly cheap.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so in line with that, you know, I guess I just wanted to get your views because I'm very concerned when we don't have reciprocity. Like if we've got high standards here, and you correctly pointed out we should have faith in our high standards here, but if other countries are not meeting those same standards, you know, like is the view in the actual agreement that we signed in the implementing legislation, or is the problem in how it's being interpreted? Like I just want to know where we can clearly fix this, because this is definitely under the federal government's clear jurisdiction, and it's something that we do need to address.
Yes, we argued from the outset that the legislation really wasn't the issue. The agreement wasn't the issue because it did stipulate that it needed to be as if it were produced in a Canadian plant. The problem was we do a good job of signing these agreements, but we don't do a great job of implementing or executing on them. And so Canada, yeah, we're unfortunately we can quickly become the dumping ground for the world if we're not careful. If we do need to manage those standards very, very carefully, and they can't just be a paper equivalent standard. They have to actually be in practice equivalent standard.
And by way of comparison, like when you look at other sectors in Canadian agriculture that export products to Europe, what kind of scrutiny are they faced with, just by way of comparison?
Well, if a plant in Canada wanted to become EU certified, there is a substantial process for them to go through. If a plant in the European Union wants to be certified to ship to Canada, it's basically a paper pushing exercise, because we say we've recognized the equivalency of the EU system. But the problem is there's so many member states in the EU, and the visits to those plants in the various member states may happen every 3 to 5 years. And so really the standards, you know, aren't necessarily upheld in the individual EU member states.
And so obviously the problems are quite evident if we want to significantly develop a homegrown processing capacity in Canada. We don't have that being applied equally.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for doing that. Just moving on, throughout the testimony that we've heard during this committee's study, a lot has been made about the grocery code of conduct. You know, from Fraser Valley, especially poultry's point of view, like, do you have any comments on that? About like, have you had any significant difficulties with Canada's large retailers, hidden fees, and so on? Do you have any comments on the proposed code of conduct?
Yes, I do. I absolutely would support there being a grocery code of conduct. We have faced the situation where we have delivered product to various of the larger chains, and there's challenges right through the process in terms of getting dock time, delivery times. Our trucks end up having to wait, 1 or 2 or 3 hours even just to drop off a couple of skids of product, and it messes up the rest of the delivery schedules. There are chargebacks. There are a number of things that we just have to accept them, because if we want to ship product to that store, and it's simply, there's just such an imbalance of power that needs to be made right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very much in line with what we've heard throughout the study. And then finally, I guess, just on the subject of access to capital, you made that as your sort of third key point for barriers. You talked about the struggle that you've had with lenders. I have had a recent conversation with Farm Credit Canada, and they are interested in this area. They were looking for some suggestions about how they can reform themselves, maybe go a little bit more into venture capital and so on. If we were to make a recommendation that specifically applies to Farm Credit Canada, what could we give to them that would bring about some substantive change?
I think there's a number of areas I think that lenders in general could do better on. I'm not sure I could even identify one at this point. I'm sorry. I've dealt with Farm Credit in the past, and they're good to work with. I'm not with Farm Credit at this point, but the process by which we can apply for money is complex and time consuming. And if we had, for example, the supply managed industries have a lot of baseline data that backs up their request for financing. We in a niche market, we don't have that. And so they have to rely on numbers that we give them. And so the process is just made much more difficult by that.
Okay, great. I think that wraps it up. I mean, just as a closing comment, I've got a few ducks around my farming property. They are a fantastic animal to raise, and I no longer have a slug problem as a result.
Nice, absolutely.
I guess the question is, are they in order? Are your ducks in order? I guess that's the other question. Sorry, I had to say that. So now we're into our second round. Mr. Epp for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Epp.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And so when I hear the comment that we use everything of the duck, I won't even ask what we do with the quack. You can make your own comments with that. So let me start on a far more serious nature. I do appreciate both the testimony and the thoroughness of the briefs. And Mr. Falk, your brief to me is very, very disconcerting. So let me start with some questions there. In the brief, I understood that you had not received an adequate response from the CFIA. The CFIB has also put a brief in support of your case to us. Are you aware, as the CFIB and the CFIA had any sort of interaction on your particular case or response from CFIA?
Yes, we have. We actually CFIB asked for and was successful in having a conference call attended by the president of CFIA, and we that was the first time I was allowed to really present my case fully to the president of CFIA, and the outcome was essentially what I've written in the brief, that I'm now supposed to just move on with a positive attitude, and that we've been told that. This is just one story from our side, and that she could tell many stories of how operators have disrespected inspectors. And that may be true, I understand that, but that wasn't my case, and I'm not sure why it would be vindictive like that and that it would justify their actions against me. It makes no sense.
Would it be safe to assume that unless the CFIB would have become involved, CFIA would have not have given you further attention?
That is very, very likely, very safe to say that, yes.
It leads into my next question. We often hear about small business being the engine of growth for our economy across all sectors in Canada. We're talking about here specifically about expanding processing capacity. And so would your comment, I'm looking for actually from both of your comments here, I would consider you to be smaller to medium-sized processing facilities to drive growth. Should that come from the large processors or large processing entity, or consistent with other sectors of the economy, would we be more advantaged to concentrate on the smaller, more regionally based processors? And then, of course, the question remains, what do you do with CFIA?
Yeah. So from my perspective, obviously I'm a small to medium, I suppose, enterprise. But I see that's the backbone of the Canadian economy, is these family-owned, family-operated farms and processing plants and so on. So I absolutely value the largest processors. There's absolutely a place for that product. There's also a huge market for that small to medium processor. There's lots of innovation that happens in our plants. There's lots of employment. There's so many plants all across Canada. And so what do we do with CFIA? In my mind, without being able to rebuild or build trust, the acrimonious relationship, that gotcha style is how I've explained it. That's just going to continue. And that has to change.
Mr. Sonesy, you referred to standards, and we're looking to standardize the standards of flow boat back and forth. So I'm going to ask you to answer the previous question as well. But can you talk about, is there a certain standard, or are they just spelled out in the trade agreements? I'm familiar with Codex and other sectors. Is that the best way to get at some standards that are beyond the purview of CFIA, that there's a third party that lays them out, that is more enforceable?
Je pense que c'est une question, on parlait des...
Well, we were speaking about small and medium-sized companies. That is a very difficult question to answer. We see ourselves as an average-sized company. What I could say there is that clearly a company such as ours in our sector has a great deal of potential. We're following all of the major trends and we're seeing some tremendous potential, so it is a good place to invest. As to the standards, well, the only comment I would make there is this. I think this already answers a bit this issue of the standards, is that you need to understand that the impact of that one person, one employee can have on the relationship with the agency can be rich in consequences. So perhaps that's where we need to look at standards, is to really have that human relationship and remove rather that relationship, because that leads to a great deal of inconsistency. And that can make the relationship very tense or in some ways even unfair.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, we're out of time now.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Epp. Thank you, Mr. Shaughnessy. And now, Mr. Blois for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Blois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to start with Mr. Falk. As I understand it, you would be provincially inspected then, and certainly we've heard some of the challenges that you've gone through. In terms of looking at whether or not you would go to a federally inspected abattoir facility or processing facility, what are some of the considerations that come in play for you in terms of whether or not that goes ahead, or whether or not you would consider moving in that direction?
So yes, we're provincially inspected at this point, and we have looked a number of times at becoming federally inspected. The barriers to that primarily would be financing, access to capital, but probably as much as that is the complexity of the system, of CFIA's rules and regulations. It's burdensome, and so as a smaller processor, we have to comply with all of the standards that the largest processor would comply with. And I would say I'll put my product up against anybody's product, be it federally or provincially inspected, but the process is different as a provincially inspected plant than a federally inspected plant. Not better, not worse. It's just different. And so I would, we look at the provincial system as being truly much more outcomes based, where we know that the federal system wants to be outcomes based, but I'm not sure that CFIA understands what outcomes based means.
Okay. I want to go, in your brief, you mentioned the Canadian Commercial Waterfowl Producers Association had produced a report, and you highlighted some of the summary in your end. Is that something you can submit to the committee? I think that would be of interest to committee members to have it. Is that something you have access to and can provide to us?
I can submit the entire report to you for sure. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to go to Mr. O'Shaughnessy.
What is the environment or the current situation vis-a-vis the Upper Canada duck industry? So how many ducks are produced every year, for instance? We have the lean duck actually is produced by 3 main players in Canada. And we are the largest, or close to being the largest producer. These are volumes of approximately 3 million birds per year. And given the byproducts, Where do you send these byproducts? Do you send them within Canada or outside of Canada? Is there an opportunity here? Because right now we are studying to improve the agricultural process in Canada, and it might be possible to keep those byproducts in Canada for the process. Is that a possibility? Well, other than the feathers, which are exported, the rest, all of the byproducts are sold on the Canadian market. There's demand for that. Currently, we cannot meet that demand, so there are imports taking place right now.
In English, just because I'll probably be better well-placed. You mentioned some of the rules and regulations, and I take notice that the European Union sometimes has very good, I'll call it non-trade tariff barriers in terms of creating detriment and challenge to be able to get products to Europe. But can you outline for the committee what some of those differences are? Because I mean, obviously, as you've mentioned, there's a higher consumer market in Europe. There is a larger economies of scale, I would suspect, in Europe with their producers. But what explicitly would we be looking at to try to close that gap and create that parity for Canadian producers?
First of all, throughout the European markets, there are differences from one state to another. It's specifically one or two countries that face specific issues, but they face the same issues as we do. There are major differences when it comes to animal welfare as well. There are issues regarding the quality of products, and that might, in fact, involve food safety, and that is something we discussed earlier. Thank you very much, Mr. Shaughnessy, and thank you very much, Cody, for your efforts in French. Mr. Perron, you've got 6 minutes. Please go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cody, congratulations. You're getting there. It's much better. So, Mr. O'Shaughnessy, I don't know if you need this, but perhaps I should turn over to Mr. Falk to answer the question. But that is, we do have a processing emergency fund that was put in place during COVID, and it ran out of money. Some companies contacted us and to tell us that they had applied, they had begun investments to improve processing, and the money ran out. Could you perhaps say a few words about this? Do you think, have you seen any specific needs there? Mr. Falk.
Yes, if I recall, that fund was 252 million. I think that's the one you're referring to. And I think that was taken up just within days or weeks at most. So there was applications made, I think, by probably all of our companies, and we didn't receive anything through that fund. And so it's unfortunate, and that fund hasn't been replenished from my understanding. And it would have been good had it been replenished. Let's say more than a day late, and for sure $1 short, maybe a bunch of dollars short. It could have been many times that, and I think we might have actually accomplished what we set out to accomplish.
OK. Quand on parle de...
So we've heard about innovation and improving the facilities at the committee. We've heard a number of witnesses, and they told us that the biggest problem was access to capital, to be able to modernize and to stay competitive and to have sufficient flexibility. Would you have any specific recommendations to make to the committee to improve this, Mr. O'Shaughnessy or Mr. Falk, regardless of who would like to answer first?
Philip, please, you go ahead.
Précisément, c'est sûr.
Well, more specifically, it's what we've heard before, that is support for automation, as I've mentioned earlier. We've reached a level where we're talking about a great deal of money. And of course, the sector involves many players. So clearly, we need very specific assistance there. So what about research and development? Do you think that something could be done there? We have academics who tell us that that a lot of the facilities are obsolete. Yes, in R&D, there's a great deal to be done. I don't think we can boast. Well, I do think we can boast of being leaders in the market, but there's a lot of work to do in the sector. And again, it's all about having access to funds. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Shaughnessy.
2.5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mr. O'Shaughnessy, I think I'll turn to you, and it will be along the same question that I had for Mr. Falk during my last intervention, and maybe you could expand upon it even if you wanted to. It's really just about the difficulties that were expressed, like the struggle in finding access to capital. And we've heard a lot also about the strategic investments that could be done by the federal government to help our processing sector. So, you know, if we were to look at a federal crown corporation like Farm Credit Canada that is in the business of being a lender, and any specific recommendations we can make for how it operates, does it need to take more of a chance, explore different sectors with greater vigor? Anything you can add to that for our report, please?
Oui, je pense que
Yes, I think there is an opportunity available to us in the markets. This is a market that meets with all of the current trends on a health level, in terms of diversity for food. It's a product that represents a great deal of potential. But to come back to my brief, yes, it's expensive to develop this product if we're the only ones who are investing in it, especially because all somebody has to do is be by the phone and answer the phone. If it's a single player who invests all of the money, then it's too easy for the others to just take advantage. So when speaking about investment, to see government investment makes only sense if everybody is going to benefit from it.
Thank you. I think I'll just leave it there, Mr. Chair. So thank you to both of our witnesses for your contributions to our study.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor, and that will wrap up our panel portion. And I want to thank Fraser Valley Specialty Poultry, Mr. Ken Falk for coming here today and telling your story, and also Canard du Lac Brome, Monsieur O'Shaughnessy. Merci bien d'avoir pris le temps de.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Shaughnessy, for having taken the time to be here.
Remind the members that we'll have to switch off and then come back for the in-camera portion of our business session. So you've got your password and everything. So we'll call the meeting. I'll adjourn the meeting, and we can all suspend, I should say, and then we'll log off and come back with the in-camera portion. And thank you so much, everyone. Okay.
Thank you.
you.